Hello, folks. Welcome back to Management 5804, Leadership in Technology-Based Organizations. I'm Dr. David Townsend, and this will be Lecture 2.1. In this lecture, we're going to keep our discussion at a relatively high level still, again, as part of the course introduction. But we want to connect some of the reading that we did within the technology strategy packet with some emerging work on Agile. And so in this particular lecture, we'll kind of briefly highlight some of the themes and concepts, ideas that we covered across the reading pack over the last 2 weeks, and then also build a bridge towards Agile. And in the next lecture, I'll spend a few minutes talking about basic Agile practices. I know many of you are familiar with these practices because you may use them within your organizations, particularly those of you who work in developer roles or manage developer teams. Agile certainly has become quite prominent and clearly is very important in that particular space. So the next lecture we'll talk about some of those practices. Here we'll continue our discussion of some of the broad challenges that we face when trying to develop technology strategy in organizations. And then, with that connection and based on the foundation from this week and last week, we'll dive into some of the specific issues that organizations face. And so we'll kind of do a deep dive into some practical tools and areas of knowledge that we need to have in order to build and execute technology strategy effectively. So with all that to say, again, the purpose of this week and last week is to continue or to build a foundation for us so that we can continue to understand the unique challenges we face as we move forward. And so in this particular lecture, we'll talk broadly about Agile strategy in complex environments. So now we'll kind of make the connection more directly between complexity and the specific angles of strategy. And so just by way of recap, we talked about the problem of complexity in our discussion last week and really highlighted four specific problems, right? And so the first one really was the diagnostic problem of trying to figure out what's even going on here. We talked about the difference between complicated and complex environments. And complicated environments may have a lot of different factors that we might consider as strategists, but that's no different than any manager in the 20th century who was running a large industrial corporation. They had many employees, many stakeholders, many things to consider. But what specifically is happening within technology arenas that tends to kind of move us from the arena of complex or from complicated to complexity is that as these factors interact and they change, it's producing an unexpected amount of kind of rapid and difficult change in our environment. So these unexpected interactions really is what spins the problem from complicated to complexity. And again, so now as stakeholders start to interact with each other, or social movements emerge, and environmental protests, or there's new technologies that emerge that allow even more transparency into a firm's environmental practices, you can see an awful lot of growing backlash. And so social media has created a whole new array of challenges for companies trying to manage their public profile. And so public relations and social media marketing execs and others within organizations have to manage the corporation's profile much differently than they did in the past. And technology itself has created a whole new era of transparency, a whole new era of activism, but has certainly elevated some of the more risky or more difficult practices happening within organizations. But that's creating some problems of non-predictability, right? And so we don't always have a model or a way to understand what's going to happen in our environment. And so again, with a wide variety of factors that we have to consider and unexpected interactions across those particular factors, that creates a non-predictability in our environment. So things happen and we're not always aware of where they're going. And so things can evolve in unexpected ways, which creates really the fourth problem of complexity for us of exponential change. And we'll actually dive into a bit more of some of the underlying factors that are contributing to rapid exponential change, driven largely by the rapid pace of technology development in this particular lecture. And again, these sort of fourfold problems here create an enormous amount of difficulty for us of trying to disentangle and trying to develop a strategy to move forward. So this DINE model we talked about requires good use of framing strategies. We talked about a couple of key principles or key steps with framing strategies of having a deep understanding of customer needs. But as we'll talk about, that doesn't mean that this is going to be even a linear process itself. And so we'll talk about in broadly or in future lectures in very in-depth ways of how as innovations diffuse or these ideas spread across markets, there's going to be different segments of customers that we're going to approach, and that requires us to approach each segment differently and acquire new understandings of what people need and want. And then what motivates people to buy our products and services. And in the middle of that, we'll talk about this notion of the jobs to be done. And this is really a fresh and important new framework for understanding why people buy things. And so oftentimes we kind of think about product markets or products as being relatively static ways to build solutions for customer needs, and then over time we kind of optimize the mix of features that we offer to people, and that's not necessarily always problematic, but sometimes we forget that people buy products and services because they want that to solve a problem for them, or they're buying it to accomplish a job for them. And so that's important to understand, because the infinite variety of products and services that are out on the market, it's not just about pricing, it's not just about branding, it's about understanding why people might be willing to purchase our product and service. What specific do they hope to accomplish by using our product? What kind of gains do they have as an individual by consuming the product? And so we'll kind of tie in this notion of jobs to be done in future lectures as a way to understand customer motivation. And then that framing, as well as understanding the tension between developing a lot of unique possible ideas or routes that we might take as an organization, and then building a coherent vision, a coherent strategy to move forward. And so we've got to have a clear sense of the direction broadly that we're trying to head, but be able to manage these options in a way that or manage that pathway in order to not close off potential options that we may need to pursue, which then requires us to really adopt the framework of experimentation. Right? And so we don't necessarily know directly where we're going, and I don't know why we're always heading that direction, but experimentation gives us the clarity to navigate these complex environments. But as we talked about, sometimes framing strategies can be based on the wrong things. And so the way that we understand what's happening in our environment, if we get it wrong, if we're diagnosing the problems wrong, or we don't anticipate some of the interactions overall, and then the predictions we make are incorrect, we can miss out on huge trends, huge opportunities, or be kind of left behind rapidly by emerging new competitors. And so that requires us to be very agile and experiment with the path forward. So within that technology strategy, and in response to these particular difficulties with complexity, refers to an integrated set of choices about how to use technology to produce competitive advantage or superior financial returns. But what's different about it is that increasing complexity that's really driven by technological change is undermining a lot of the traditional logics that we use. And so as the reading highlighted, this is bringing out a whole new array of choices that we have to make when we're running corporations. And so this notion of disruption is important because new technologies oftentimes enable companies to do very new things. And so the digital age is bringing a way to do advertising that we typically didn't have in the past. And so if you think about Facebook, to some degree disrupting the traditional advertising industry, Facebook is able to really pinpoint and connect consumers with products and services they may or may not necessarily be interested in, but it brings that connection much more closer together, and it allows them to actually profile customers in a very precise, robust way to sell the data back. Not justifying or legitimating the way that they've actually built their business model, but certainly it's very different than someone advertising on TV or on the radio, where they're broadcasting the message very broadly to a whole variety of people. And so the sort of mass media age of sending out messages to huge segments of the population is over, and we can really micro-target people in sometimes very extreme and in somewhat troubling ways. And so the digital age clearly is disrupting a lot of traditional ways that we've organized and conducted our business. And the diffusion and spread of these new ideas, right, creates an awful lot of nonlinear change, right? And so we don't always understand or know or be able to predict how people are going to respond to it. And this is part of this exponential change. And there's this underlying pattern that it talks about or the reading talked about, this S-curve pattern that tends to show up. And this is driven oftentimes by the inherent complexity of the environment in which the innovation itself is diffusing. And so in the second group of modules midway through the semester, we'll spend a lot of time talking about diffusion of innovation and how this pattern unfolds and how it requires us to adapt and experiment with our strategy as we move forward. And in the third half, we'll talk about this notion of designing new organizational forms and structures. And so new business models have emerged. It's not the traditional industrial era of a large manufacturing plant producing a commoditized good or service for a very well-defined set of customers. And so these new business models are emerging and oftentimes organized around platforms that companies build to connect different types of customers and different types of suppliers. And so much more kind of an underlying network structure that's there that over time, in certain cases, can involve in entirely new ecosystems. Right, so these platforms evolve into these massive ecosystems where there's an enormous number of suppliers and customers interacting together. And to compete effectively with an ecosystem requires new, fresh resources, but it also creates enormous new opportunities for companies to innovate and kind of ride these different technological waves. And so the challenge of developing effective technology strategy is enormous for organizations. Beginning at a rapid pace of change is undermining a lot of the traditional ways that we've approached questions of strategy. And so to that end, this question of the past being prologue is really going to be at the heart of how we tackle these questions this semester. And as we'll talk about here in a bit, the pace of technological change is really leading to a lot of new opportunities, but enormous challenges for incumbents. And so the specific problem with disruptive innovation oftentimes is the dilemma that it creates. And so many companies who are the best performers, who have successfully reached mainstream customers with incredibly effective and well-designed products and services, oftentimes are the ones that are most susceptible to the competitive threats at the margins of their industry through disruptive innovations. There's a particular pattern and a set of challenges that incumbents face that we'll really unpack over the next couple weeks. But as companies start to adapt themselves to these new ideas and respond to new disruptive innovation, again, even new entrants face a problem of trying to spread their ideas throughout markets. And so this problem of innovation diffusion, or the technology adoption lifecycle, is problematic because it's really a pattern. This S-curve pattern is a pattern of nonlinear change. That means the rate of change, how quickly markets adapt, how quickly people purchase and adopt new products, doesn't happen in a linear or uniform manner. And so market shares can change dramatically, especially as we saw with BlackBerry, our Research in Motion's BlackBerry. At one point, 55% market share, and then within 18 months, they'd lost almost all of the market share to a new entrant, to Apple, who was not a first mover, was not the first one to produce the smartphone. And so that nonlinear change created an enormous set of challenges for the company. And this is really part of this broader cycle of creative destruction. And so as we sort of think through the pattern of how new innovations spread, but then how, as they spread and as they gain traction in mainstream markets, how that leaves those companies susceptible to new innovations at the margins of their industry, it raises enormous questions for companies about who is the customer, and then even more importantly, when are these people going to be our customers, and how do we reach them at different stages. And so this problem of innovation diffusion is really going to be one of the crucial things that we'll tackle. And then thirdly, the way to design innovative organizations. And we'll spend some time talking about this notion of dual transformation. Right? How do we balance the old versus the new? And so if we're an incumbent company, how do we adopt a business model where we have digital, we're enabled by digital technologies, but still reach some of our old customers? And how do we balance the meeting the needs of our mainstream customer with new early adopters who are looking for fresh new ideas as a means to solve some of the problems that they have? And so this requires us to leverage, but also to develop new core capabilities. We also have to figure out how to time markets effectively and achieve growth and sort of ride these exponential waves, these rapid changes that happen. This is also creating a real challenge as we move and again sort of undermine traditional logics where large industrial companies typically operated under the assumption of economies of scale. So the idea being that you want to serve as many customers as possible. It's kind of Henry Ford's famous adage, you can have any color you want Model T as long as it's black. right? And that was the logic of the industrial era. Is we're going to produce highly commoditized products, right? The same thing, and we're going to try to spread it to as many people as possible. And a lot of that was based on the notion that the capital expenditures, right, the fixed cost that that firm had. It's enormously expensive to build a manufacturing plant for cars, and so you want to be able to produce the same car over and over again, because not only do you get better at it, not only does it become cheaper over time, but the more you can reach customers with that same product, you can drive down the underlying unit cost that those fixed costs themselves are requiring. And so, as one of my colleagues likes to put it, he worked in the pharmaceutical industry. Producing a brand new therapeutic medicine, it costs $1.3 billion for the first pill, and then after that, it's only a couple cents per pill, right? So all that upfront fixed cost is enormously expensive for companies to contend with. But digitization and some of these digital products that are out there have a very different underlying economic logic. And the way that you can actually manage hyper complex product lines and operations now, and you think about a company like Amazon and the clever use of from A to Z with the little swoosh kind of there at the bottom of the logo, they can offer an enormous number of products using these pretty sophisticated digital technologies that many companies in the past would have completely collapsed trying to do. And in that sense, we've shifted from economies of scale to economies of scope, and looking at how to combine and piece together multiple different markets. This also creates enormous power because oftentimes companies were responding reactively to changes in customer demand or to competitive threats. And now there's a much more proactive set of strategies that companies use organizational design to accomplish. And this notion of shaping strategies, of how you influence how that market itself is going to unfold, is becoming increasingly important. So we'll tackle some of these logics towards the end of the semester. Because if you start to see a combined scope versus scale, the kind of holy grail here is to build a controlled ecosystem where you really do shape and in significant ways how that market or how that entire transactional space is run. And so if you think about ecosystem strategies that Apple has been able to develop, they have an enormous influence on how their customers are able to, how they even understand products and services and how they're able to engage. And so, the combination of these things is part of this challenge in dealing with the cycle of creative destruction. It never stops, right? So the more successful you are as an incumbent, that leaves you susceptible to new entrants jumping in. And so we'll kind of move through these three problems and then talk about the connection between the three. And so disruption oftentimes, creates the underlying S curve, and the way that we organize across the S curve and design products and services to reach customers, to move from early adopters to mainstream, leaves us susceptible to disruption. And so we have to organize and design our organizations differently. And we're constantly dealing with these challenges as the company and as technology continues to evolve. And a lot of it, again, is there's this fundamental pattern. So those of you familiar with Ray Kurzweil's work, he's now the chief engineer at Google. He's got this notion that he calls it the law of accelerating turns, that part of the process or rapid pace of change of technology is simply just what's happening. And this is kind of the flow of history. And he talks about the space between new innovations emerging. And so those of you who know this really well, he's got some crazy predictions about what he thinks is going to happen over the next few decades. And I think you can see some evidence of some of these technologies at least approaching some of the patterns that he's predicting. And so in the next couple of years, he's thinking there's going to be a computer that develops that surpasses the brain power of a human. And certainly continued advances in supercomputing are reflecting some of these sort of possible outcomes. But then he said by 2045, right? So not super far away, just a decade and a half or a couple decades and a half, that we'll have computers that have all more than the brain power of all human brains combined. And again, he's basing this on some specific logics of how technology itself is advancing. But again, the point being here that this process of creative destruction and the underlying challenges that exponential improvements to technology and the rapid pace of technological change, they're not stopping. They're just going to continue to get faster and faster and faster. And that's going to lead to an enormous amount of change in our environments. And so the role of the technology strategist is never over. there's still an enormous amount of things that have to be done for organizations in the future to continue to adapt and position themselves to be effective. And in that, there's a lot of speculation now that Moore's law itself is coming to an end, and certainly the way shrinking the number of transistors, they're shrinking the size of the transistors down. Certainly they're on the nanoscale now, and so we're kind of approaching some of the limits of the laws of physics on silicon-based chips and others. And certainly there's kind of the different ways to stack these chips and different chip architectures that are leading to continued improvement. But Kurzweil's argument, which I think is interesting, is that overall Moore's law is not the end-all be-all, right? He calls it the fifth paradigm and suggests that there's going to be a brand new underlying architecture of technology that's going to emerge over the next 5 to 7 years, and that will sort of shift from from our Moore's law silicon-based chips, that type of design, to something new. Now, what's interesting is he kind of lays out some contenders in some of his work, but I think there's certainly a lot of interest in quantum computing and quantum chips, or qubits being the underlying or the sort of next wave. And certainly the more you understand about that, you understand there's some real technical scientific challenges that still need to be resolved before we see this become inevitable. But there are some interesting developments, and many large tech companies are making multi-billion-dollar investments in this particular technology. So that could be the fifth paradigm, right? So we could have a new set of change that kind of takes over from where we're at. So all that to say, if he's right, and this really does emerge, quantum computing, or maybe DNA computing, or other platforms, if that really does follow the sort of the end of Moore's law now as a new platform, then this pace is just going to dramatically change even more. So quantum computing, what it's capable of doing and the speed at which it's able to do it, is so enormous that again we will just see a continued exponential change around these different technical advances. So the connection for us is that this is a transitional moment for strategists, right? And so this rapid technological change, people are speculating it's the end of Moore's law. If Kurzweil's right and others, it's really just the end of the beginning, right? I mean, the computer age is just getting started, and the quantum age in particular is going to be something that changes security, changes computing platforms, changes the way that we run our businesses. And so this kind of shift from a binary to a quantum age, this transitional moment that we're in, places a premium on us of building good technology strategies. There are a lot of difficult strategic problems that we'll face, and so specific issues that these technologies pose towards efficient organizing that require us to think differently about how to build and manage organizations. And so this kind of industrial logic of organize and execute is giving way to experiments and emergence, right? And so we don't lock ourselves in with organizing organizational strategies to particular strategic positions, but we're constantly experimenting and evolving to adapt to the many complex changes that are happening. But these ideas are connected in a fundamental way, I think, that requires a different toolkit, and that really becomes the purpose of where this class is at. And so, as by way of introduction, right, last week and this week, giving you kind of a high-level big picture, these are the ideas we want to focus on this semester, and we want to do deep dives into the toolkits, logics, and frameworks that are going to allow us to see technology strategy differently, given the unique challenges that we're facing in an increasingly complex age. And so one of the big tools we'll talk about is Agile strategy. And as I mentioned before, many of you are used to, you're familiar with Agile as you've tackled it in your, maybe in your daily work life if you're a developer or you manage developer teams. But Agile is now moving from the development arena into the strategic arena. And so it's now thinking about these experimental and emergent strategic positions where we move iteratively through an environment that we don't always understand and can't predict, but it allows us to move from position to position to constantly adapt and capitalize on new opportunities. And so we'll use some of the logic of Agile to understand how to build and manage organizations through this process where we can't always foresee where we're going. In the next lecture, we'll spend more time talking about Agile as a product development process as a foundation for the Agile strategy that we'll cover over the remaining semester.